From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome once again to The Sculptor's Funeral, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher of sculpture and art history in Florence, Italy. The Sculptor's Podcast is devoted to practitioners of figurative sculpture, both student and professional, discussing various topics of art history and current events related to the field. And today, our discussion is going to piggyback a bit on last week's episode on the education and teaching of Francois Rude. I talked a little bit about different methods of training for sculptors, how the methods of Francois Rude differed from how sculpture was taught to the students of the Académie nationale de peinture et de sculpture, known today as the Ecole des Beaux-Arts in the 19th century. And I talked a little bit about the nature and structure of ateliers, which were sort of like student co-op studios, patronized by a master, in which students of the Ecole were able to experiment and learn from the older students, sort of away from the regular classwork of the Ecole, yet still under the guidance of an experienced master. This episode is going to be entirely devoted to this subject of the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, the training sculpture students received, and what the experience was like, both at the Ecole and in the ateliers of the 19th century. I'm going to be referring to the experiences of different sculptors at different times throughout the 19th century, drawing from a few different sources to build a sort of a picture, a general impression of what it was like to study sculpture in 19th century Paris. The first thing I should mention, throughout the podcast, I will be referring to the Académie nationale as the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, because I know that's the most familiar name to most people listening. But it should be pointed out that the Ecole des Beaux-Arts only got that name in 1863, when the school officially became independent of the French government and went through a series of reforms. Now, before then, before 1863, it was called the Académie nationale de peinture et de sculpture, but it was also called the Académie nationale des Beaux-Arts, and sometimes even referred to as the École nationale spéciale des Beaux-Arts. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly in French. But anyway, the teaching institution itself still exists, although its name was changed once again in 1968 to the École nationale supérieure des Beaux-Arts. But for the sake of clarity, I will be referring to the school generally as the Ecole des Beaux-Arts when I talk about it, both pre- and post-1863 reforms. Technically, it's not correct, but the usage is so widespread, it's probably going to cause more confusion if I use the correct names than if I don't. So here I go. So, the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. If you had to describe the Ecole system in one word, that word probably would be competition. Every step of the way through school, students were required to submit sculpture projects of various sorts, which would be judged against other students' work and then ranked accordingly. This ranking was made public, so at all times, every student was acutely aware of their position in the school relative to their classmates. Even the admissions process into the school included ranking. You were ranked among other newcomers even before studying a single day in the École des Beaux-Arts. The admissions process, first of all, required that each student had prior training somewhere else, although that could take just about any form. I mean, drawing school or apprenticeship or some other experience. You had to have a letter of recommendation from your former professor. And then, aspiring sculptors had to prove their ability to draw. Typically, this was done by a test, where applicants had to draw from an antique figure over the course of 6 hours. If your drawing skills proved satisfactory, you moved on to the second stage, where you had to model a figure from life over the course of 12 hours. How you did with this figure determined your initial standing within the Ecole. Each student's figure was given a number, sort of a number ranking, 1 would be the best, and your number determined your place amongst other newcomers, but it also gave you your actual physical place in the live model room when classes started. The better the number, the better your seating assignment was in the model room. And apparently they really packed students in, and Several students would have, sort of mediocre views of the model if their number was pretty low. However, there was a finite number of spaces in the model room, and if there were more applicants than spaces, those who received a ranking lower than the maximum number you could fit in the room, well, they were refused admission into the Ecole des Beaux-Arts as first-class students. So that's the official method of getting into the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, and testing for admissions happened twice a year to become a first-class student at the Ecole. Now, if you were able to meet all the other requirements for entry but failed the admissions competition, your number ranking was just too low, you were still a student at the Ecole, but you were a second-class student. So you're still allowed to attend the atelier, but you could not take place in the scheduled competitions and move up in rank and move through the school. But there were other, less official ways of getting into the Ecole. In a nutshell, if a professor of the Ecole said you could work in his atelier, then you could. And this could happen at any time of the year. And you would just start working as a second-class student. You would just be unranked until the next admissions competition, which, of course, happened every 6 months. One such unofficial entry into the Ecole des Beaux-Arts happened in 1880, and it was recorded in lengthy letters and journals that student wrote. The student was the American Laredo Taft from Illinois. He wrote letters home almost every day of his 5-year stay in Paris at the Ecole, and they are a fantastic source of insight into the life of a sculpture student in the 1880s. Laredo Taft was a mild-mannered and witty sort of guy, a really good writer, but in addition he was a teetotaler, a non-smoker, a non-partier. He was terrified of pretty girls, and altogether he was a bit of a prude. Sort of the opposite sort of character you would expect from an art student in 1880s Paris. Outside of school, his main preoccupation was teaching Bible study courses at the local American Protestant church. No Moulin Rouge for Taft. Anyway, I'll be quoting a few passages from his letters, which I'm taking from an excellent little book called Laredo in Paris by Alan Weller. So let's hear from Laredo Taft himself as to how he got into the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. Now, his plan was to arrive in Paris, find lodging where he could, and hopefully spend the summer practicing up for the entrance competition in the autumn. It didn't work out that way. Just days after arriving in Paris, Taft took a letter of introduction from a mutual friend to John Boyle, an American student who had been studying sculpture in Paris for a few years. Taft writes, "I found Boyle in a little attic room with only a skylight window, but his greeting was as cordial as though he were welcoming me to a drawing room. He is from Philadelphia and has been here 3 years, and to my great disappointment tells me that he returns to America this week, having received an $8,000 order from a wealthy Chicagoan for a group of Indians. He can think of nothing else, says it will be the making of him, as he had never had the means to attempt any important work." After a little talk and a look at numerous clay sketches of Indians, he took me over to the Ecole des Beaux-Arts and showed me Monsieur Dumont's atelier, where he had started. Of course, that dirty, mud-spattered room looked like paradise to me. Then came the best of all. He proposed that we call on his professor. I agreed, though scarcely knowing what the visit was for. Monsieur Dumont is very old, and lives within a few steps of the school in the Institute building, the home of the famous Academy of France, of which he is a member. It seems that Boyle had been a good student, and the venerable old sculptor welcomed him pleasantly. After a few minutes conversing, and an occasional glance at me, who sat dumb like a sheep, Monsieur wiped his glasses, hunted around for his pen and ink, and shortly handed over a paper bearing the following announcement. "Monsieur Director, I have the honor to beg you to inscribe on the list of students in my atelier Mr. Laredo Taft." Paris, 11th July, 1880. And so look at that. No entrance exam at all, and Taft is already a second-class student at the Ecole. We'll hear more from Laredo Taft in a moment and get his personal take on several aspects of school life. But first, let's discuss the structure of the training at the Ecole. So, once you were accepted, your education followed a general pattern and rhythm throughout the school year, punctuated by competitions at regular intervals. In the classroom, you attended daily sessions of modeling from a living model or from a plaster cast of an antique statue, and this alternated each week. So you got 1 week in the model room, next week in the cast room. Your instructor would be a member of the academy, and would come in and correct the student's work, set the pose, offer advice, etc. Most of this sounds probably pretty familiar to the modern atelier student. A mixture of working from life and working from casts was the standard then, as is now. One aspect of atelier practice which might surprise some listeners is that these weekly exercises, either working in clay from life or from the antique, were not saved. They weren't cast, they weren't fired. At the end of the week, the clay models were scrapped, and the clay thrown back into a large tub and was used again for the next project. One of the first-year students was usually assigned the task of keeping the clay in good condition. Now, as a teacher, I can see the value in scrapping work each week. Learning how to start a figure is one of the more difficult things to learn as a new student. Having to start a figure each week means the student learns to focus on the sort of overall look of the work, the balance, the proportion, the volumes of the figure, and ignore details. Details quite often bog down the beginner. This method would also develop speed and accuracy in the beginning stages, which is a valuable thing to learn. The practice of scrapping the work also gives a bit of perspective, I think, to beginner students who tend to be just a little bit precious about their initial creations. Years ago, I tried to institute this practice of weekly projects that weren't going to be saved, and I tried to start it up in the middle of the school year, and the students were not having it. They practically mutinied on me. Well, maybe I'll give it another try sometime. Anyway, it was standard practice in the Ecole. And in addition to the weekly studies, as a student of the Ecole, there were daily opportunities to draw and study from antique cast collections, visit museums, attend lectures, and work on your own projects in the atelier on your own time. But there were some big problems with the way the Ecole operated before the reforms of 1863. For one thing, your instructor, the master of the Ecole, would be there for critiques and instruction several times a week, or maybe just once a week. That depended on how engaged your professor was with the class. Some cared more than others, it seemed. The frequency of studio visits was entirely up to each teacher. Not only that, but before 1863, the instructors rotated monthly. They weren't associated solely with a single classroom or a single group of students, as was the case with Laredo Taft's experience in 1880. And among these rotating instructors, there was no agreement as to the curriculum or the focus of the instruction. Now, this could be a good thing. You could get a well-rounded assortment of opinions and advice rather than simply the dictates of a single instructor. On the other hand, one instructor one month might offer contradictory critiques to the preceding month's instructor. So your education would also consist in learning what was expected of you from each instructor, rather than reinforcing and strengthening your skills in a progressive fashion. A former student of the Ecole who officially chronicled the reforms of 1863, Olivier Merson, had this to say about the level of engagement sometimes found in the classroom. Quote, "During the month he is on duty, the professor enters the room where the students are drawing or modeling from casts or from nature, and going from place to place, he makes this one lengthen a too short leg, and that one shorten a too long arm. I knew a professor, he was a sculptor, who, during the sitting, stayed seated in the corner of the study room. There he waited for students to bring him their studies, and although from his armchair he could see at most the model's back, he mercilessly corrected figures done in profile, three-quarters, or straight on, as if they were all the same thing." Unquote. Now, of course, it wasn't always like that, but the lack of accountability for instructors was a problem. And it wasn't the only problem. Another issue that seems almost unbelievable these days is that no distinction was made between painting and sculpture students. They were put into the same classes and worked from the same model at the same time. How in the world was this done? If a sculptor had an assigned place in the room and wasn't working up a relief, how does one see all the angles of the model? The model certainly wouldn't have rotated because that would be useless for the painters. In addition, your monthly instructor could either be a painter or a sculptor, meaning your instructor likely was not as competent and thorough in both medium. He was, going to favor or be more interested in or more knowledgeable in either painting or sculpture. and it kind of guarantees that one faction of the class or the other would suffer each and every month. Fortunately, the reforms put into place in 1863 eradicated these practices. After the reforms, sculptors were with sculptors, painters were with painters, and instructors stayed with a group of students much more consistently, ensuring accountability for the instructors and continuity for the students. In fact, professors after 1863 opened their own official ateliers right in the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, as exemplified by the Atelier Dumont, which Laredo Taft attended. Now, these official école ateliers were quite separate from the ateliers which still flourished outside the curriculum in the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, such as the ones that were patronized by David d'Angers or François Rude in the 1830s and 40s. That tradition of an independent atelier still continued. I talked a little about them in the François Rude episode. Ateliers outside the official école ateliers became known as ateliers libres, or free ateliers. We'll get Laredo Taft's first-hand account of student life in an atelier of the Ecole des Beaux-Arts when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners. Just a quick shout-out for my new sponsor. In case you haven't heard the good news, the Sculptor's Funeral is now brought to you in part by Blick Art Supplies, the oldest and largest supplier of professional art supplies in America. Everything a sculptor needs, from your favorite clay modeling tools, modeling stands, armature supplies, clays, plasters, molding and casting supplies. They have it all, and the shipping in the U.S. is free on most items if the order is over $100. And best of all, ordering your supplies from Blick Art Supplies directly supports the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. Just go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, click on any of the Blick buttons you find on the homepage or on the episode pages, and shop away. A percentage of your purchase goes to support the show, and it's very much appreciated. So the next time you need art supplies, click on Blick. And thanks. So, what was it like in the ateliers of the Ecole des Beaux-Arts? Each atelier, apart from the general instruction, projects, and competitions going on, developed structures and traditions amongst the students themselves. Some had reputations of being strict and autocratic little ateliers, and some were known as party ateliers. But in each, the idea of student rank was pervasive. Older students were known as anciens, the ancients, and the new students were referred to as the nouveaux. The nouveaux were often subjected to all sorts of initiation and hazing, sometimes pretty brutal hazing, to the extent that poor Laredo Taft had heard about it all the way over in America, and he was terrified of his entrance into the Atelier Dumont. Along with the hazing, he knew that as a new student, he would be expected to sweep the floors and tend the clay, but also he had to pay dues, like everyone else, which would pay for materials and upkeep of the studio. But a nouveau's first payment also is used for something else, a drinking party and a dinner known as a goutte. Laredo Taft describes his first day in an atelier and this rite of passage, the goutte, vividly. After the usual morning occupations, I went over to the Ecole at 10 o'clock, as Boyle had set that time for meeting me there. He came late, but I occupied the time in closer inspection of our atelier, the boys all being away, engaged in examination, competitions, etc. When he came, we went first to the office, where I presented my letters and was told to call for my card. We met a few of the boys, to whom I was introduced, they all shaking hands affectionately and saluting me as Monsieur Nouveau. 12:30 was set as the hour at which I was to meet them, pay my fee, and partake of the usual feast. So we parted with another affectionate handshake. The entrance fee, part of which is for the feast and wine, is from 60 to 80 francs. As this was about the extent of my private purse, I thought I had better go over and have my draft cashed, although the idea caused me deep anguish. I was introduced to a few more boys, and then found the master or the chief of the year, and paid my bill, and was very glad to find that they had let me off with the lowest rate, 60 francs, or about $12. One greedy youth proposed that the silver I had in my hand go for cigars, but I pretended not to understand, and returned it to my pocket, resolute within, although very smiling without. There were only a half-dozen boys present. this being, as Boyle assured me, the very best time of year to join. Some have gone, and many are engaged in competitions, etc. The money being paid, they pressed around to shake hands once more, and a rousing cheer was given in honor of the nouveau. Of course, my face beamed with delight. I thanked them repeatedly for the honor, and shook hands with the utmost enthusiasm. One lonely Russian, with his white eyes and red hair, who talked German with me, and translated for their benefit, announced himself as the interpreter of the day, and in the exuberance of his emotions assured me that I was now free to come and go, make myself at home, do what I pleased, and that everything there was mine. Next followed the banquet and spree. Boyle had told me to get out of it if possible, but after demurring for some time I saw that they would take it amiss if I refused, and, thinking that I had paid well for my dinner, and ought to have the benefit of it, I assured them that it was only a question of time with me, and that if it didn't take long, I should be enchanted to accompany them. Their joy at once became intense. They affirmed that there really was no other way to become one of the brotherhood. So we started to the nearest commerce de vin, or in English, saloon. Poor mamma, how you would have been shocked to see me there, in the midst of that rollicking company, each with his bottle and glass, and most smoking. Boyle told me this eve that he had seen as many as 30 in that little room, but as I was aware, I had struck up a most fortunate occasion, and so had only 7 companions in my revellings. Beside the peaceful character of the occasion, another advantage was that they were enabled to provide a more sumptuous repast. They did not seem to feel hurt at my not tasting the wine, though my glass was filled from each bottle, and my attention frequently called to it. I assured them that I never drank, but I bowed my acknowledgments when they drank to the health of the nouveau. The first course was cigarettes. The second, sardines, bread, wine. Third, wine. Fourth, beefsteak and bread, also new bottles of wine. Fifth, wine and cigars. Sixth, coffee. Seventh, wine. Of course, I patronized the sardines, steak, and bread with due interest, and I found a glass of café noir excellent. By this time, my friends, and there are 2 or 3 of them who I think I shall like very much, they began to become quite lively, and amidst the general hilarity I would frequently hear demands for a song from me. Now, you know I particularly pride myself on my musical talents, but I would very much dislike to display them before so uncultured an audience. Still, I didn't know what means they employed to extract the music from me, for Boyle had told me that this was one of their favorite diversions. So, from that moment, I seemed utterly incapable of understanding anything that was said, and I had been a tolerably silent partner all the time, as you may guess. In vain my Russian comrade put it in German, but I only smiled. The childlike innocence of that smile would have delighted you. But when they appealed to another American, who had come in, and with whom I had been talking, I was obliged to inform the public that I couldn't sing a single squeak, and that my whole youth had been clouded by this misfortune. Finally, our other American delivered a portion of Woe Emma in his usual artistic manner. This was accepted as a substitute, and the company rose to depart. Another conspiracy was formed, and it was decided that, as I couldn't sing, I must treat for cigars. I thought of my fleeting francs, Papa toiling at home, my attic chamber, bread and milk and bouillon, and I concluded that I had paid enough. They drew around me with inquisitive faces and pleading hands, and as I was in considerable hurry to move on, I finally asked, in a faint voice, how much they wanted. After a prolonged computation, the answer came from the master, 14 sous. I could hardly keep from laughing as I handed over a franc. 2 of the boys ran off with the money, and instead of buying cheap cigars for all, got 2 or 3 first-class ones for themselves. But I must do them the justice to say that they privately offered me one. Again, a fresh handshaking all around, many kind wishes from them that Monsieur le Nouveau would enjoy his stay here and carry off the Prix de Rome, and many more appreciative smiles from the Nouveau. And so we parted, they doubtless thinking that they had here at last the greenest of a verdant race, and I with a much better opinion of the French student. His letters go on and on like that. It's really a fantastic resource. He really paints a vivid picture of his experiences in Paris at the time. By the way, when the students of the Atelier du Mont wished Laredo Taft all the best at carrying off the Prix de Rome, they were just being nice, or more probably making a joke. Foreigners, like Laredo Taft, were ineligible for the Prix de Rome. It was an honor reserved solely for the French. If anyone listening is interested in further anecdotes or a true account of what it was really like, I cannot recommend this book enough. It's, again, called Laredo in Paris. It's a gold mine. I'll quote just one more brief passage about Taft's experiences in the Atelier du Mont, and this story coming from a little later, when Taft himself was an ancien, one of the older students. There's a new student in the Atelier du Mont, and he's refusing to partake in one of the initiations for the nouveau, the practice of forcing a nouveau to pose nude for the rest of the class. Quote, "An English nouveau is in our atelier, doubtless a good fellow, but pretty coarse. The Frenchmen took a dislike to him, especially when he objected to undressing for their aesthetic gratification. They pressed closely upon him, pushing him towards the clay tub, into which they evidently proposed to tumble him. He had seized the spade and held them at bay, when I happened in, and, seeing the situation, offered my services as mediator. As he could speak not a word of French, it was a serious moment for him. If, in his excitement, he had struck one of the tormentors, it would have been more serious still. I explained the situation to both parties. I made them acquainted with Anglo-Saxon repugnance to undressing before an assembly of strangers. They begged me to assure them that it meant no harm. It was just one of the traditions of the Ecole, and each of them had been obliged to submit in his turn. I reminded them that I had not, and I finally succeeded in negotiating a compromise, a payment of an extra 5-franc piece in recognition of the traditions. I think he will escape further indignities, although his sour face is not likely to win their favor. During the model's rest, he stepped outside, and the boys profited by the opportunity to ornament the lofty ceiling above his head with chunks of clay, which, drawing, let go and fell in a thud in unpleasant proximity to his skull. His only modeling tool was slyly abstracted, enveloped in clay like a dumpling, and launched into space, there to hang far out of reach for a day and a night. One of the boys said he knew only one word of English, and he would call him by that, whereupon he was solemnly christened Water Closet, and sent to chopping clay under that designation." Unquote. And here I thought it was only my students that threw balls of clay to stick up on the ceiling. But even with all this horseplay and tomfoolery, the students somehow found time to study and work, and there was a lot to be admired in the general curriculum. Students of the Ecole had a much broader field of study than that of today's ateliers and art academies. Students, in addition to working from the antique and from live models, studied composition, architectural and decorative sculpture, facial expressions. Lectures were held regularly by experts in every field that could possibly relate to their studies. For instance, in the first weeks of Laredo Taft's experience at the Ecole, he attended a lecture by a professor of archaeology, which concerned ancient Roman clothing and accessories like belts and helmets, complete with demonstrations in draping togas in various ways. And in each of these fields of study, competitions were held regularly, and the students were ranked again and again. So much of the classwork being done throughout the school year was study and preparation for the next competition. The domination of competitions in the Ecole des Beaux-Arts had a deep effect upon how students learned and what was expected of them as artists. As judging one work of art against another is a kind of a tricky proposition, the Ecole constantly strove to make the competitions as fair as possible. Work submitted to these competitions was anonymous, and parameters of the competitions were tightly controlled in every way imaginable. And this makes sense if you're trying to be fair, right? You can't judge the creativity and originality of one student against another without having a great deal of structure. Otherwise, it would just be trying to compare apples to oranges. So the competitions were as specific and rigid as possible, which had the effect that when a student was capable of originality or creativity within these strict guidelines, it would be all the more apparent. To give an example of the specificity of these competitions, here's an example of a relief modeling competition done in 1850. As usual, the theme is taken from antiquity, and the subject is the general Coriolanus. But it's a precisely specific scene. I'll quote the description of the scene that the students received and which they were supposed to illustrate. Banished from Rome, Coriolanus was seated at the hearth of the king of the Volscians, with whom he had sought refuge. The latter, warned that a stranger had asked hospitality, arrived with his warriors. At this moment, Coriolanus, who had been enveloped in his cloak, revealed himself to the king and told him that he had sought out his former enemy to avenge himself on the Romans. So that's a really, really specific scene, right? The competition explicitly calls for a seated Coriolanus by a fireplace, revealing himself from under his cloak to his former enemy, who was accompanied by his guard. Each relief in the competition was expected to contain every element. The rigid control over the contents of the student's relief means that the works can be more easily judged against each other on the merits of their compositions. And we've seen this before in art history, of course, right? The Ecole Des Beaux-Arts didn't invent this practice. If we go all the way back to the competition between Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi in 1401, the competition for the commission of the doors of the Florentine baptistry, we see in both of their competition reliefs, which survive to this day, exactly the same contents. They are both rendered at the precise moment when the angel of the Lord stays the hand of Abraham from killing Isaac. In addition, both reliefs contain 2 other shepherds, a donkey, and a ram. The lesson here is that the more tightly you prescribe the contents of the works of art in competition with each other, the more visible creative treatment and skillful manipulation becomes. But in the Ecole, the competitions were constant and ongoing, which also meant that the rigid control of a student's production was also constant. Students were allowed to be as original and creative as they could within the context of the competitions, but this was creativity in a very limited and superficial way, not in any sort of fundamentally original way. This really is the paradox of systematic art training, whether it's in the Ecole of the 19th century or today's academies and ateliers. Without forbidding, to a certain extent, a student's creativity and providing clearly defined parameters in which a student must work, if you don't do that, it's very difficult to impart skills and chart a student's progress. Of course, it's these skills and progressions which will strengthen that student's original work and creative work later in their career, after their formal education is complete. It can be sometimes difficult for an art student to understand that. It can be difficult for the world at large to understand it as well when scrutinizing today's representational academies and ateliers. A common complaint from those outside the world of today's ateliers is that the students from a given atelier all produce very similar work, and so the atelier must be merely churning out a formulaic approach to art. That criticism isn't entirely unfair. To be sure, art students without a strong voice or a personal artistic impulse will churn out the same sorts of work as a career artist as they were taught to do in school. But those who are creative before they went to art school will be creative after they graduate. There is no sense in encouraging the expression of creativity in a student of an atelier when the point of an atelier is to learn technique and improve skills, not necessarily to create works of art per se. The ateliers don't stifle creativity and originality. They are just focused on different aspects of what it takes to be an artist, aspects like skill and technique, which of course are largely lacking in other types of schools elsewhere. I think most students of today's ateliers understand this. I've met several who don't, however, and it's very frustrating for both the student and their instructor. More than once I've had a student balk at my refusal to let them do whatever they wanted, as opposed to doing what I'm teaching them. And I always respond to them in the same way. I ask them, if you want to do your own thing instead of learning what I can teach you, what are you paying me for? Why are you paying for the privilege of wasting my time? Having said all that, the Ecole des Beaux-Arts' rigidity was a different animal from today's academies and ateliers. Crucially, the Ecole training system was a single part of a larger system of the arts. Unlike today, artists weren't expected or encouraged to pursue new avenues of creativity after leaving school. Whether the patronage was coming from the Empire of Napoleon, or the Bourbon Restoration, or the constitutional monarchy, or the Second Empire, France had an official taste and style. And not conforming to that taste and style cut an artist off from a major source of career opportunities, from commissions to recognition to teaching positions. The rigidity of the school competitions were, among other things, an exercise in limiting an artist's field of vision down to what was officially acceptable, as preparation for what was to follow in their careers. This refined, limited, controlled taste, of course, has its roots in neoclassicism, but in later years expanded slightly to include themes from biblical and historical sources. Generally, it is what is known as the academic style. And the academic style explicitly rules out excesses and radical changes and favors control. And when I mean explicitly, I mean it is part of the definition of academic style, as defined by the Dictionary of the Ecole Des Beaux-Arts, published in 1859. And I'll quote you from the dictionary written by the academicians themselves. Quote, "True academic style is characterized neither by constraint nor by emphasis, but by a marked tendency towards the noble and the delicate. It is the protest of the disciplined imagination against its unbridled counterpart, of an inspired yet convinced and scrupulous art against a careless and negligent one, a return to antiquity which sees in physical beauty the image of moral beauty, a means of transporting souls to a higher sphere of greatness, purity, and the ideal." So it says right there, as the Academy itself defines it, academic style is a protest against unbridled imagination. It's a scrupulous art, a moral one, a refined one, whose goal is purity and idealism. But art as refined and moral as this, it's not going to come naturally to the likes of the coarse student body of the Ateliers du Mans. And so the relentless competitions with their narrow parameters, prescribed themes, and intolerance of deviation helped to beat the academic style into the students. But anyway, back to the competitions themselves. Now, out of all these competitions, only one really mattered, the annual Prix de Rome, the winner of which could expect a lifetime of success and recognition from within the French academic system. Now, rather than a single competition, the Grand Prix was a series of contests with different rounds of eliminations, testing the students on a variety of tasks. In the first round, in which dozens of sculpture students would compete, students had to design a relief sketch based on a mythological or historical subject, and had one day in which to do it. This was a test of composition skills rather than modeling skills. And from this first round, all but 16 were eliminated. The second round required sculpting a nude figure from life during 3 6-hour sessions. The judges of this second round weeded the contestants down to 8. Finally, these 8 contestants faced off in a kind of complex, multifaceted competition. The work to be performed was either a figure in the round or a relief. It alternated every year. Like in the first stage, the students were given a subject and then had one day to model a composition sketch. But then, these composition sketches were stamped with an official seal, cast in plaster, and then placed under lock and key. Then, over the next 2 months, each student worked in his own special competition cubicle, producing an enlarged version of his initial composition sketch. It had to be as faithful to their initial composition as possible. However, the students were not allowed to refer to their original composition sketch or any other reference. They had to do it completely from memory. They are also not allowed any other reference materials in building their work. No drawings, no écorchés, no live models, and so on. With one curious exception, they were allowed to have casts of body parts from living subjects. The figures sculpted had to be about 2/3 life-size. Then, after 2 months of modeling this 2/3 life-size figure, without the aid of models or any other resource, the finished works were all placed in a line, and the initial composition sketches that they did 2 months ago were brought out of storage. The initial sketches were very carefully compared to the finished works, the judges measuring everything to scale and noting even the smallest changes like the turn of a head or the placement of a leg. If the changes were judged to be significant, those contestants were eliminated. And after this, the vote was taken by the jury, which was, of course, comprised of the sculpture professors of the Ecole, and one talented student was declared the winner of the Prix de Rome. Although it should be noted that, on rare occasions, 2 students won, and at other times, no student won. I really admire the complexity of this last stage of the Prix de Rome. Its complexity demonstrates the range of what a student of the Ecole was expected to learn. To have instinctual knack for composition, to have a trained and reliable memory, and to have studied anatomy, drapery, armor, and decoration to the point where, in 2 months, without using models or any other sources of information, relying solely on experience and imagination and memory, could create a complete statue. I used to look at examples of winning sculptures of the Prix de Rome, and I was never really too impressed until I learned that they were sculpted completely out of the mind of the student. And when I look at the winning sculptors of the Prix de Rome in this light, they seem a lot more impressive. The figure modeling competitions that have sprung up in the last 2 or 3 decades in and among our academies and ateliers, they really pale in comparison to the Ecole's 19th century standards. The skills required of the students who competed for the Prix de Rome may well serve as a goalpost of sorts for our own studying and teaching, something we can collectively or individually aim for, if our goals include regaining the prowess and artistry of the 19th century. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember, you can subscribe to the Sculptor's Funeral podcast in iTunes to receive each episode delivered to your computer, tablet, or smartphone automatically and for free. And when you go to the iTunes store, don't forget to leave a rating or a review of the podcast if you like it. If you want to listen to some of the older shows, such as the episode on Michelangelo or Donatello or Cellini and many others, the only place you can hear the complete archive is at our website, thesculptorsfuneral.com. And when you're there, check out our sponsor, Blick Art Materials, and support the podcast by clicking that link and getting your art supplies there. Finally, come and talk to me. You'll find me over on Facebook at the Sculptor's Funeral group page. Leave a question or comment, read additional articles about sculpture-related topics, and meet and engage with other sculptors and sculpture students. Again, thanks for listening, and have a productive week.